In the deep, humid jungles of the Philippines during the early 1950s, a squad of communist rebels stumbled upon a horrifying sight. Lying on the muddy trail was the body of one of their own comrades. He was pale, unnervingly so, and his eyes were wide with a terror that death had not erased. But the most chilling detail was on his neck. 2 small, dark puncture wounds, as if he had been bitten. His body had been completely drained of blood. Could this be the work of the creature they tell their kids at night when they want them to behave? Was this the Aswang, a local mythological creature reminiscent of a vampire? What these rebels didn't know was that the monster hunting them was actually the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the true story of how the CIA weaponized superstition, staged fake vampire attacks, and waged a psychological war using the monsters from Filipino legends to fight the spread of communism. To understand the CIA's vampire operation, we have to look at post-World War II Philippines. Liberated from Japan in 1945, the nation gained independence from the US in 1946, but this freedom came with strings. The Bell Trade Act ensured US corporations had equal rights to Philippine natural resources, fueling economic dependency and simmering resentment. This environment revived the Hukbalahap, or Huks. Led by Louis Taruk, these celebrated World War II guerrilla heroes had fought the Japanese and now sought political change, winning seats in the 1946 election. However, the US-backed government, composed of the very landed elite the Huks opposed, refused to let them take their seats. Faced with persecution, the Huks returned to the mountains and took up arms against the government. By the late 1940s, they were a powerful insurgency with widespread popular support. For Washington, this was an unacceptable development. The Cold War was escalating. With China falling to communism in 1949 and the Korean War erupting in 1950, the domino theory was in full effect. The Huk Rebellion was seen as the next domino. The local Philippine army was corrupt and losing ground, so the Central Intelligence Agency stepped in, dispatching one of its most creative operations to turn the tide. The man the CIA sent to Manila, Edward Lansdale, was a former advertising executive from California, a master of marketing and persuasion who had found his true calling in the shadowy world of intelligence. He was charming, unconventional, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand what made people tick. He believed that wars weren't won simply by killing the enemy, but by winning over the population, a concept he would later popularize as winning hearts and minds. Lansdale wasn't interested in blunt force. He was a student of what he called the battle for men's wills. Lansdale arrived in the Philippines in 1950, officially as an advisor to the Philippine military. His real job, however, was to orchestrate the destruction of the Huk movement. He immediately recognized that the government strategy was a disaster. The Philippine army was behaving more like an occupying force than a national protector, with its brutal tactics alienating the very villagers whose support they needed. This brutality, Lansdale saw, was the Huk's best recruiting tool. He knew that to beat a guerrilla army, you first had to sever its connection to the people. He devised a two-pronged strategy. First, he needed to reform the government and military from the inside. He identified and championed a dynamic politician named Ramon Magsaysay, pushing for his appointment as Secretary of National Defense. He gave the people a credible, non-communist alternative to believe in. But Lansdale's second strategy was far more clandestine. He knew that conventional military operations in the jungle were costly and often futile. The Huks knew the terrain and could melt away into the foliage. Lansdale decided to turn their greatest advantage, the dark, mysterious jungle into their greatest fear. He began studying the local folklore, digging deep into the superstitions and ghost stories that had been passed down for generations in the rural villages. He was looking for a psychological weapon, and in the terrifying lore of the Philippines, he found the perfect monster. In the folklore of the rural Philippines, few creatures inspire as much dread as the Aswang. The Aswang is a shapeshifter, a creature of the night that can appear as a beautiful woman, a giant bird, or a vicious black dog. In its most feared form, it's a type of vampire, a ghoul that preys on the living, using its long, proboscis-like tongue to suck the viscera from its victims, or, in some tales, to drain them of their blood. For people living in isolated villages in the 50s, surrounded by the impenetrable darkness of the jungle, the Aswang was believed to be a present threat. Lansdale recognized the power of this belief. He saw that a Huks soldier might be brave enough to face a government patrol, but he might not be so brave when faced with a supernatural predator. The plan was put in motion when Lansdale's team learned of a Huks squadron firmly entrenched on a particular hill. Conventional military assaults against the position had been costly and ineffective. Critically, Lansdale's intelligence noted that the locals, and by extension the Huks soldiers recruited from the area, believed that an Aswang lived on that very hill. This was the opening he needed. A government PsyWar team was dispatched to the area, laying an ambush along a jungle trail frequented by the Huk patrol. As the rebels passed by late in the day, the team waited patiently. They targeted the very last man in the line, the drag, snatching him so quietly that his comrades ahead of him noticed nothing until it was too late. The captured rebel was killed, then, using a technique they had presumably planned in advance, they punctured his neck with 2 clean holes, mimicking the bite of a vampire. Finally, they hung his body upside down by the heels until all the blood had drained out of him and into the soil. The pale, bloodless corpse was then placed back on the trail where it would be easily found. As Lansdale wrote, the effect was exactly what he had hoped for. When the Huks returned to look for the missing man and found their bloodless comrade, every member of the patrol believed that the Aswang had got him. The news spread like wildfire through the rebel camp. The following morning, without another shot being fired, the entire Huk squadron abandoned their fortified position and fled the area in terror. The story of Operation Aswang is so dramatic that it's tempting to believe that a single fake vampire was responsible for the downfall of the entire Huk rebellion. The reality, of course, is more complex, but the impact of Lansdale's psychological warfare cannot be understated. On a tactical level, these operations were stunningly successful. They were cheap, they required minimal manpower, and they achieved results that conventional military force could not. By transforming the rebels' cultural beliefs into weapons, Lansdale made the jungle feel haunted and hostile. Soldiers who had been committed to a cause were suddenly more afraid of the dark than they were of the government. Edward Lansdale's success in the Philippines made him a legend within the CIA. When the United States found itself sinking into another, far larger counterinsurgency in Southeast Asia, he was one of the first men they called. Lansdale took his playbook to South Vietnam in the mid-1950s, but the ghostly echoes of his Filipino operations would be heard most clearly over a decade later. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become a bloody stalemate, and the US military was desperate for any edge it could get. They turned back to the Lansdale model: weaponize the culture. The operation was called Wandering Soul. Its foundation was a deeply held traditional belief in Vietnam that a person who dies a violent death far from home and whose body is not given a proper burial and the correct funeral rites will not be able to find peace. Their soul is condemned to wander the earth aimlessly in pain and misery. For soldiers fighting a brutal war in the jungle, the thought of becoming a wandering soul was a profound spiritual terror. The US Army's 6th PsyOp Battalion went to work. They hired South Vietnamese actors to record chilling audio tapes. On them, the synthesized, ghostly voice of a dead Viet Cong soldier would drift through an eerie soundscape of funeral music, crying and shrieking. The ghost would call out for its mother and father, lament its pointless death, and beg its living comrades to lay down their weapons and return to their families before they suffered the same agonizing fate. These tapes, given names like Ghost Tape Number 10, were then broadcast from powerful speakers mounted on helicopters or carried by patrols into the jungle, echoing through the trees where the Viet Cong were hiding. The goal was identical to that of Operation Aswang: to manipulate the enemy's deepest spiritual fears, to erode his morale, and to make him feel that he was being hunted not just by an army, but by the angry dead themselves. While its overall effectiveness is still debated by historians, thousands of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese soldiers did surrender, some of them clutching leaflets that had been dropped alongside the ghostly broadcasts. So, was the CIA justified in creating Operation Aswang? Was weaponizing a nation's folklore a brilliant masterstroke? Or was it a moral line that should never have been crossed? Let us know your thoughts on this bizarre and chilling chapter of history in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.